Welcome to another special edition of Daily Airline News, focusing on the tragic loss of Air India Flight 171. I'm Geoffrey Thomas, and I'm delighted to say once again joined by my co-host Richard Godfrey in Frankfurt, Germany. Good morning, Richard.
And good afternoon, Geoffrey.
So today's episode, obviously focusing on Air India 171. The episode's titled Crash Scenario. Today, before we get into this scenario, we would like to make a short statement. Out of respect to the privacy of the 260 victims of the crash, 241 on board the aircraft and 19 on the ground, and out of respect to the victims' families and friends, as well as their carers, their supporters, we are not going to discuss any details concerning the victims, other than to say all victims have been identified and all bodies have been handed over to the families. We request our viewers to follow this guideline. Any comments revealing inappropriate victim details will be deleted. So many analysts have concluded that the Air India crash was a dual-engine flameout. If this scenario is correct, then why did the dual flameout occur? Was this a simultaneous dual flameout, or was there a time delay between one engine failing and the second engine failing? The aircraft managed to get airborne, but video evidence shows the initial climb only lasted about 8 seconds. The aircraft appears to hover for a short time, slip sideways briefly, descend slowly, and then crash. Today we examine the known facts and see if these facts fit the observations. We present a hypothesis based on certain evidence, calculations, observations, and assumptions. Richard, so can you give us an overview of your analysis?
Yeah, I published earlier today on my website the crash scenario analysis, and we're going to include a link in the description below today's episode for the viewers. I divided the analysis into 3 phases: the takeoff roll from brake release or takeoff thrust application to rotation, the initial climb to the highest point reached, which may have been just after the last ADS-B data point, and finally the descent from that highest point to the crash. We have included a screenshot of the assumed key data points for the takeoff roll. We have ADS-B data just after takeoff. We have the aerodrome chart from the Indian Airports Authority. We've got environmental data from the US NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, for Ahmedabad Airport at the time of the short flight. We have data from Boeing aircraft flight manual and from General Electric for the GNX engines. We know exactly how many people were on board and how much fuel was required for the flight to London. We don't know how much cargo was on board, but we do know the maximum allowed takeoff weight for a Boeing 787-8, given the runway length and the runway slope and the dry surface condition on the runway.
So, Richard, what factors determined the length of runway used for the takeoff?
Well, it's a long list. There are 17 factors that are taken into account that affect the length of runway used. The most important are the aircraft weight, the thrust setting, and the flap setting. Then there are important environmental factors like the wind strength and direction, the air temperature and air pressure, the runway slope, whether it's going downhill or uphill. In this case, it was going slightly downhill. And the surface condition, was it dry and a good condition runway, which was also the case in this crash investigation. You then have to consider the initial climb and any obstacles after the end of the runway. You also have to consider the runway length in case there is an engine failure. You need sufficient runway length in order to stop if you're going to abort a takeoff. You need sufficient runway length for a longer takeoff if it's too late to abort and the pilot decides on a one-engine inoperative takeoff. We're showing another screenshot with the assumed key data points for the initial climb, which also need to be taken into account when you're working out the exact amount of runway you'll use for a takeoff.
So what runway length does the 7878 normally require at Ahmedabad Airport for an aircraft with 242 people on board, based on your list of assumptions?
Well, the calculation comes out about 1,900 meters, plus or minus 50 meters. But the interesting thing is the video evidence of the takeoff shows the aircraft used more like 2,600 meters.
So that's a big difference, Richard. So how do we explain that difference?
Yes, it's a very interesting point. The rotation point requires a runway ground roll of 2,540 meters, according to the Boeing data, which is longer than normal, and it is the exact amount of runway length required when you have a one-engine inoperative takeoff. So it really does point to the fact that after the decision speed V1 was reached, that the aircraft experienced a single engine failure, but it was too late to abort, and the pilot decided on a one-engine inoperative takeoff. The takeoff speed at rotation is estimated at 160 indicated airspeed, which is 167 true airspeed, or 170 knots ground speed when you account for the winds, which is also higher than normal, but to be expected on a OEI, one engine inoperative takeoff. This aligns also with the ADS-B ground speed of 174 knots at the pressure altitude of 625 feet above mean sea level, which we work out is about 303 feet above ground level. The Boeing manual also has a calculation for the takeoff field length. They call it TOFL, TOEFL. And that comes out at 3,260 meters, which allows for obstacle clearance after you pass the end of the runway, and also allows for a one-engine inoperative climb capability. The Air India crash flight is compliant with the regulation based on the Boeing TOFL of 3,260 meters. The actual runway length is 3,505 meters. It is not clear to me, however, whether Air India flight met the usual 15% dispatch margin, which is a planning buffer on this calculation. The climb gradient is estimated at 5.09%, which is slightly above the normal range of 3 to 4% for a takeoff go-around thrust setting for the Boeing 787-8, but still well within the limits.
So the aircraft managed to take off, but it seems to get a few hundred feet above the ground, but no more.
Yeah, that's correct. We calculate the true altitude above the runway level at 303 feet. This is, as I say, reported in ADS-B data as a pressure altitude, and we did a sanity check on this by doing the calculations, which are in the analysis that we've linked to this episode. But we did a sanity check using the video evidence. The Boeing 787 wingspan is 197 feet. If the geometric height was 303 feet, that would mean about 1.5 wingspans. So visually, a height of 1.5 wingspans above the ground aligns with what we see in the video, which is a shallow, low climb consistent with a possibly degraded climb performance. The aircraft peaked earlier on this climb, then leveled off, then started descending while passing over obstacles. It barely cleared one obstacle by around 50 feet, which is tight, but of course is sufficient. And this explains the visibly flat profile in the video and supports the notion of a degraded climb due to hot conditions, heavy weight, and limited thrust in a one-engine operation.
But a 7878 can climb easily on one engine.
Exactly, and that's the key point. So the second engine must also have failed.
But the pilot reported thrust not achieved, not a dual engine failure.
And I think that is the key point and the very important point. If there was a dual engine failure, then the aircraft would have descended much faster and crashed much sooner than it did. And you have to remember the landing gear remained down, the flaps extended, and the rat was deployed. And all of those three items add drag to the aircraft. The glide ratio would have been about 3.5 to 1. In this case, what they call a dirty configuration, as opposed to a clean configuration of the aircraft. And in a dirty configuration with the gear down, flaps extended, the rat deployed, and a glide ratio of, say, 3.5 to 1, the aircraft would have crashed around 320 meters from the end of the runway if there was a complete failure of the second engine. But the aircraft only crashed around 1,620 meters from the end of the runway. Again, a big difference. And this is only possible if the second engine was still operating and still producing enough thrust for a glide ratio of about 17 to 1. And that is why the pilot stated thrust not achieved. There was some thrust, but not enough to maintain altitude.
That's a huge difference, Richard, in the glide ratio, 3.5 to 1 and 17.5 to 1. And clearly there was significant, well, not enough, but significant thrust coming from one of those engines.
There was some thrust coming from one of those engines, but by no means the full thrust. So I completely agree with other analysts who say this was a dual engine failure. And in one engine, the takeoff, it seems to be a complete failure. But in the other engine, it can't be a complete failure. It's still provided some thrust, a low level of thrust, but not enough.
So what does all this mean?
Well, the thrust required to overcome the drag of the gears down, the flaps, and the rat, and to slowly sink and lose altitude at a glide ratio of 17 to 1 is only about 7 to 10% of the full takeoff go-around thrust from one engine. So that aligns with one engine providing a moderate to low power, possibly just above idle or in an approach idle, low, continuous state. So this was not a true glide. Thrust was being used to offset drag, but there was definitely not enough thrust in order to climb. And the rat may have been deployed preemptively or in a degraded electrical state, but was not deployed because of a complete dual engine failure to below idle.
So, with all this data, Richard, what does this tell us about the aircraft weight?
Yeah, so we're showing a screenshot of the aircraft weight scenarios I considered. The first scenario came up with 195,310 kilos, which is simply my estimate of a takeoff weight based on the number of passengers, the fuel required, and a moderate amount of cargo. I looked also at the maximum takeoff weight, which is 254,000 kilos. And I also considered an overloaded scenario at 270,000 kilos. And these different scenarios, when you look at them in terms of the thrust or the low or moderate thrust, it fits with my estimate of a takeoff weight. But it doesn't fit with an aircraft at the maximum takeoff weight, and it certainly doesn't fit with an overloaded aircraft. So as I analyze each scenario and ask the question, can an aircraft glide 1,620 meters from an altitude of 303 feet above ground level? The estimated aircraft weight does fit, and the fact that the aircraft was overloaded and the engine was having to work, the second engine was having to work much harder, does not fit.
So, what does this tell you about the speed of the descent and the time taken for the descent?
Well, the weight of an aircraft affects the true airspeed required for that glide ratio of around 17:1. We're showing another screenshot of the estimated true airspeed and in knots and then in meters per second. And the airspeed increases from around 180 knots to 195 knots if it was at maximum takeoff weight, and to 205 knots if it was overloaded. And a heavier aircraft must fly faster to maintain the same lift to drag ratio and angle of attack. And we're showing another screenshot with the estimated descent time. And for my scenario, the estimated descent time is 17.6 seconds. And the actual descent time, when you look at the video, was around 18 seconds. So that also aligns quite well. And this implies no significant excess weight, otherwise the descent would have been faster. It also implies the descent was controlled and it was not steep or accelerated, which is what we observe in the video. It also implies that a low to moderate thrust is being used by the aircraft to counter the drag and preserve airspeed.
So, your conclusion from all this, Richard?
Well, the 18-second descent time from 303 feet over the horizontal distance of 1,620 meters fits very closely with my estimated takeoff weight, around 195,000 kilos. So this implies the aircraft was not overloaded. It implies the descent was not a glide with both engines in under idle. At least one engine was still producing a low amount of thrust. And this was not a simultaneous dual engine flameout. So speculation that the pilot did not taxi down the runway to the start of the runway and try to do a short takeoff is false. Speculation that the aircraft was overloaded or overweight is false. The takeoff weight meets the regulatory requirements. And speculation that this was a simultaneous dual flameout, like US Airways 1549, the Miracle on the Hudson, is also false. And I conclude it's not possible to assign or presume blame either to the pilots or to the operator or the manufacturers at this stage of the investigation. On the contrary, at this stage, from the facts that we do know, it appears that the pilots were doing a good job, the Air India operator was doing a good job, and the manufacturers, Boeing and General Electric, were acting professionally and competently and had also done a good job. So the cause of the crash is not going to be easy to determine and is not obvious. And we will need to wait for the data from the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder whenever the investigators are able to release that data to us.
That's an extraordinary analysis, Richard, and which really underscores why it's so important that we have this data, or the airline industry has this data from the black boxes as quickly as possible, because on the surface of it, there doesn't appear to be a simple cause of this crash. It appears to be very, very complex.
Indeed, it does. And so, again, you can understand, I think, why I was upset about the delay in getting the black boxes to New Delhi and being downloaded and analyzed, and also understand why I was upset about the crash site being cleared so quickly. So I hope that the investigators will provide us with at least some interim information on what they have been doing and what they have found so far. Obviously, we can't ask them to draw conclusions from that, but they could at least give us an update of where they've got to so far.
Indeed, because there's 1,100 787s out there. Each one's carrying about 300 people. So you've got you've got tens of thousands of people flying on 787s every day, and you've got a real mystery which needs to be solved very, very quickly to give them comfort. And if there is an issue with the plane, which has never come across before, then it can be solved. Or whether it's an operator issue, again, something that's never happened before, that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And in the past, we've seen when issues have been found. For example, there was an issue with the Boeing 787 in the past with the lithium batteries, and aircraft were grounded until that was resolved. So flight safety comes first. But if operators around the world and the aircraft manufacturer is not informed, then they can't be expected to ground aircraft or produce airworthiness directives and problem resolutions and fixes for whatever it is that the data points out in the investigation.
Yeah. So, once again, Richard, thank you for all your work on this scenario. Absolutely fascinating. And as Richard mentioned, there is a link below to the analysis on his website. So click it on and have a look. It really is fascinating. Viewers, thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. And if you don't, please do. Thank you for the likes. Thank you for the comments, which are tremendous and very supportive, and we do appreciate them very much. And please keep those questions coming. They are fascinating and raising some very, very interesting issues. And tomorrow we'll be addressing the questions from the Air India tragedy, and in particular, this particular episode. So once again, Richard, thank you for your work on this.
You're welcome.
And viewers, please tune in tomorrow for another edition of Daily Airline News, focusing on the tragic loss of Air India 171. Thank you.